Hi, welcome to the Heroines Literary Festival. I am Amra Pajalic, and I'm here to introduce my memoir, Things Nobody Knows But Me. This memoir is a story of me growing up. So, my mother suffered from bipolar, and it is about growing up in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change, and a lot of stigma towards mental illness. So I am of Bosnian background, as is my mother, and we actually grow up not knowing what my mother's illness was. We called it nervous breakdown because that's what the words that we understood and knew, and that's what my mother thought it was. And so the journey of my childhood was trying to make sense of all these experiences that I was going through, and the changes that my mother was going through, and trying to, have a relationship. Anyone who has a family member who suffers from mental illness knows that there are difficulties with that, where the person that changes when they are under the influence of the illness. So bipolar is characterized by the highs, so the manic highs, and then the depressive lows. And this was one of the things that I grew up with my mother suffering. And we had a difficult relationship at certain points, and I think that's something that a lot of people who have family members who suffer from mental illness can relate to. And so writing this book was me trying to make sense of my experiences growing up, trying to put them in perspective and create a shape around them, and also trying to tell my mother's story and honour her life. Because of her mental illness, she didn't get a chance to, do a lot of things. She didn't get a chance to work or to have a career or to get an education because of the toll that the illness took on her, but also because she was from that generation of women who were migrant women who came to Australia for a better life, and in a sense became victims to this dream of a better life, because they gave up their family and they gave up so much. And so that was what her life was about too. And so writing this book, I tell people I was writing this book my whole life, because I've written various versions of it. And it took me a long time to really be able to tell the story properly. The first version I wrote, I was studying a Diploma of Arts in Professional Writing and Editing, and I did it as a non-fiction subject, and I titled it Sins of the Mother. So I was writing it from the perspective of that wounded child who still had a lot of anger and a lot of unresolved issues and a lot of judgment towards my mother. And this final version I started when I was 31 years old. And that was when I had my daughter. And I sort of went through this experience of almost suffering PTSD, where all these memories of my childhood kept flashing back to me. And I kept looking at my daughter and feeling such love for her and judging my mother a lot. And then when my daughter was 10 months, I suffered from postnatal depression, and that was very difficult. And that experience really made me reevaluate my mother's experiences, because I was 31 years old when I had my daughter. It was the country of my birth in Australia, in a supportive relationship. I had been with my husband at that point for 11 years. I had support networks around me, and yet I found the experience so mind-altering and so difficult. It led to the postnatal depression. And my mother, on the other hand, was married when she was 15 years old. She came to Australia. She did not know the language. She fell pregnant immediately after birth and immediately after getting married, and gave birth to my sister when she was 16 years old. And she suffered postnatal psychosis, which is an illness that only 1 in 1,000 women suffer from, and it is a precursor to bipolar. And so, as a result of that illness, she ended up in a mental health ward, and she was there for 6 months. And at this time, so this was in 1970, the only well, not the only, but the main course of treatment for mental illness was electric shock therapy. And so actually she helped me obtain her medical health records under the Freedom of Information Act, and she was subjected to electric shock therapy 3 times a week. And after 6 months she was released, and in that time I think she'd seen her daughter, my sister, only a few times. So that bond of motherhood was completely broken. And so when I was writing this book, initially I wrote it from a dual point of view, from my point of view growing up and from my mother's point of view. And I found that that really helped me think about and understand her perspective and think about what it was like for her to go through some of these incredibly traumatic experiences and come out on the other side. And I really began to appreciate her ability to survive, her ability to deal with incredible hardship and still be able to move forward. So I was very, very happy to write and have this book published by Transit Lounge. My mother has actually passed away, but thankfully she was with me when the book was published, and she was with me at the launch, and she was with me for the initial reception to the book, and that meant so much to her. She was incredibly generous in sharing her life and her experiences, and when she read the initial draft, she only asked for 2 things to be changed about my stepfather to protect him, nothing to be changed about her. And I thought that was incredibly generous on her part, because, I really, I lay us both bare, in a sense, in this book. And she always said to me, if this book only helps one person, then it will be worth it. And after it was published, I would visit her and I would read reviews, and I would read letters that I'd received from people. And so many people spoke about knowing someone who has a mental illness or experiencing it themselves in some way. And it meant so much to hear those letters and to read those reviews. And she would just keep crying. Every time I would read it, she would cry and cry, and she would make me cry too. But I'm really glad that she was there for me. She was there with me for that, and that I have those memories of her. So, also I just wanted to show you this. I've got a sticker. I got shortlisted for the 2020 National Biography Award, which is pretty awesome. I'm sad she wasn't here to see that. So I'm going to read an extract. I actually first just want to read the dedication, because this is the purpose of the book. This is what I was trying to do with my book. So, dedicated to my mother Fatima and all the women who came before me, whose lives were full of sacrifice so that mine could be full of choices. And for my daughter Sophia, who stands on the shoulders of these strong women and is able to reach for the sky because of them. And so that's why I wrote the book. I wrote it for her, I wrote it to honour her, and I wrote it to honour the women in my life and in my family. So I'm just going to read the prologue. I'm just going to get my emotions under control a little bit. I was 16 when my wagging caught up to me. It started when I stayed home to ensure my mother didn't drive while she was under the influence of her illness, but I continued to forge her signature long after she recovered. I ended up in my high school counsellor's office. Mum has nervous breakdowns, I told Miss Meadowcroft. She frowned. What does she suffer from? What do you mean? Mum called it slomjivaca in Bosnian, which translated to nervous breakdown in English. That's what she and everyone I knew called it, and that's what I'd grown up telling people. Miss Meadowcroft asked me what happened when Mum got sick. I explained how she got insomnia and cleaned the walls with bleach until her hands were pruned and wrinkled, that she went on shopping sprees at Copper Art and emptied our bank account, the way she physically transformed with her green eyes glowing as if she were drug affected, and her speech slurring as if her tongue were too thick in her mouth, the delusions that spewed from her lips that she was going to speak to the President of the United States and stop wars, or that she was training to race an Olympic champion. Miss Meadowcroft nodded as I spoke. I explained that there was no logic to Mum getting sick. She got sick when she was taking her medication. Sometimes she got sick when she didn't. She got sick when she was stressed, and she got sick when she wasn't. The one thing that was a constant was the complete shock I felt every time. It seemed as if her illness transformed her overnight from a caring mother to a self-involved woman who was unaware of anyone else. Miss Meadowcroft's questions made me think. I went home that night and asked Mum what her illness was called. Nervous breakdown. What causes it? The doctors told me that there was a chemical imbalance in the brain. I was bewildered. This was the first time I'd thought of her illness as something that could be controlled. When I returned the next time to talk to Miss Meadowcroft, she had a surprise for me. I did some research about your mum. She handed me some sheets of paper that were photocopied pages from a book. Does this sound like your mum's illness? I took the sheets and began reading. The sheets were about manic depression and described it as an illness that was characterized by manic highs and depressive lows. When the person was suffering from mania, they engaged in impetuous and reckless behaviour, including spending money, being sexual and losing inhibitions. When they suffered from lows, they would struggle to get out of bed and become suicidal. More recently, the illness has become known as bipolar disorder. As I read, I felt a shock thrumming through my system. I didn't know it at the time, but this moment would change my life. This is my mum, I gasped. There was a pattern to my mother's illness. It wasn't something that just happened, but instead there were signs that until this point I had been ignorant about. I went home with Mum with the pieces of paper. Mum, I think you have manic depression. Mum looked at me with curiosity. Some doctors said I have schizophrenia. Some said manic depression. This is all about you. I handed her the pieces of paper. She took them from me and read. This is what you have, isn't it? I asked. Mum nodded. Why did you call it nervous breakdown? That's what we called it at home. My mother's homeland was Bosnia, once called Yugoslavia, which used to be under communist rule. Mental illness was stigmatised and shameful. This had shaped her view of her illness as an affliction and a curse. Her rudimentary English also made it difficult for her to engage in the medical jargon surrounding her illness. After this, everything changed. It was like a veil had been ripped from my eyes. I stopped seeing Mum's illness as an entity that had no logic. Having the correct label meant understanding that Mum had no control when she was under the influence of her illness. Until then, I had judged her and found her wanting as a mother, a wife, a human being. I realised I couldn't judge Mum for her failings. She was a victim of her own brain chemistry, and as her daughter, my role was to accept and love her for who she was, not who I wanted her to be. This is our story. Miss Meadowcroft was actually at the launch of my book, which I was really happy about. So she is one of the many teachers who changed my life. And as a teacher myself, it's one of the reasons that influenced me to become a high school teacher. And so I also love that I've got that homage to that moment in my life and how teachers can literally change people's lives. And sometimes it's not the actual moments in the classroom, it's those connections and those relationships. So this is my memoir, Things Nobody Knows But Me. I am Amra Pajalic, and thank you very much for watching and being a part of the Heroines Literary Festival.